Glory be to the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. My beloved ones, we are blessed to be in the fast of the Holy Apostles from June 16th to 29th. As we observe the Apostles' fast these days, we are truly blessed to study and meditate on St. John's narrative of calling of the first disciples. Calling of the disciples is mentioned in St. John's Gospel, chapter 1, verses 35 following. Unlike the Synoptic Gospels, the fourth Gospel presents the first disciples, all of whom are directly encountered with Jesus. At the very outset, we see John the Baptist pointing beyond himself. That is, he tells his disciple about Jesus. There was no jealousy in John when he tells about Jesus to his disciples. There is no harder task than to take the second place when once the first place was enjoyed. But as soon as Jesus emerged on the scene, John the Baptist never had any other thought than to send men to him. So the two disciples of John the Baptist followed Jesus. Jesus did something entirely characteristic. He turned and spoke to them, that is to say, he met them halfway. He made things easier for them. He opened the door that they might come in. Here we see the symbol of divine initiative. You might have heard the word synergy. Synergy is God's initiative along with human participation coming together to perform or to accomplish an act. So here, God always takes the initiative. He comes half the way to meet us. Jesus began by asking these two men the most fundamental question in life, that is, what are you looking for? It was a very relevant question to ask, especially in Palestine in the time of Jesus, because were they legalists looking only for subtle conversations about the little details of the law, like the scribes and the Pharisees? Were they ambitious time servers looking for position and power, like the Sadducees? Were they nationalists looking for a political and a military commander who would smash the occupying power of Rome, like the Zealots? Or were they humble men of prayer looking for God and for His will? So the answer of John's disciples was that they wished to know where Jesus stayed. They called him Rabbi. You know that it is a Hebrew word which literally means my great one or a teacher. It's a title of respect given by students and seekers of knowledge. So John the Evangelist was writing for Greeks. He knew they would not recognize that Hebrew word. So he translated it for them by the Greek word didaskalos, which means teacher. What they meant was that they did not wish to speak to Jesus only on the road in the passing. They wished to linger along with him and talk out their problems and their troubles. Or they want to meet Jesus not as an acquaintance in the passing, but as friends in his own house. Jesus' answer was, come and see. The Jewish rabbis had a way of using that phrase in their teaching. They would say, "Do you want to know the answer to this question? Come and see. We will think about it together." So when Jesus said, "Come and see," he was inviting them not only to come and talk, but to come and find the things that he alone could open out to them. John finishes that paragraph by saying it was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So biblical scholars, they suggest that when someone quite aptly mentions about the exact timings, it could be that very person writes the gospel. So at 4 o'clock on a spring afternoon in Galilee, life became a new thing for him. It may very well be that he finishes that way because he was the one of the two himself. He could tell you the very hour of the day, and no doubt the very stone of the road he was standing on when he met Jesus. That was a scholarly assumption that John is the second disciple who followed Jesus. In verses 40 and 42, we see in Revised Standard Version that Andrew first found his brother Simon. In the ancient Hebrew manuscripts, there were two readings regarding this. Some manuscripts use the word proton in Greek, which means first, and that is what is translated in the RSV. There is some other manuscripts which use the word proi instead of proton, which means early in the morning. So some scholars, they see that this translation is more apt because it suits better the story of the first momentous week that I have told you. St. John depicts or narrates the first 6 days as we have in Genesis. So, in order to denote that the event is taking place on the next day, most scholars take the word proi for proton, which means early in the morning of the next day. Again, John explains a Hebrew word in order to help his Greek readers to understand better. That is, we see Andrew saying to Simon, his brother, "We have found Messiah." And in brackets we see, which is translated the Christ. Messiah and Christ are the same word. Messiah is Hebrew and Christ is Greek. Both mean the anointed one. We do not possess a great deal of information about Andrew, but even the little that we know perfectly paints his character. He's one of the most attractive men in the apostolic band. As we are now in the Apostles' Fast, it is truly blessed to know a bit deeper into the characters of the apostles. Andrew, first of all, was characteristically a man who was prepared to take a second place. Again and again, he is identified as Simon Peter's brother. It is very clear that he lived under the shadow of Peter. Andrew was not one among the inner circle of the disciples. When Jesus healed Jairus' daughter, when he went up to the Mount of Transfiguration, when he underwent his temptations in Gethsemane, it was Peter, James, and John whom Jesus took with him. So it would have been so easy for Andrew to resent this. So he always took the second place. He was quite content to stand back and let his brother have the limelight. He was quite content to play a humble part in the company of 12. Secondly, Andrew is characteristically the man who was always introducing others to Jesus. There are only 3 times in the gospel story when Andrew is brought into the center of the stage. There is one incident in which he brings Peter to Jesus. That is the first one that we now discuss. There is another incident in St. John itself in chapter 6 verses 8 to 9 when he brings to Jesus the boy with the 5 loaves and the 2 small fishes. Also, there is another incident in St. John itself in chapter 22 in chapter 12 verse 22, where we see Andrew bringing the Greeks who inquire about Jesus to the presence of Jesus. So it was Andrew's great joy to bring others to Jesus. He's the man with that missionary heart. Andrew is a great example in that he could not keep Jesus to himself. When Andrew brought Peter to Jesus, Jesus looked at Peter. When Jesus saw Simon, as he was then called, he said to him, "Your name is Simon, but you are going to be called Cephas," which means rock. In the ancient world, nearly everyone had 2 names. One would be Greek name, because Greek was the universal language, and everyone would have a name in his own native tongue. For example, Thomas was the Aramaic name, and he had a Greek name, Didymus, which means twin in Greek. So then Peter and Cephas are 2 different names. They are the same name in different languages. In the Old Testament, we see a change of name denoted a new relationship with God. We see, for instance, Jacob became Israel in Genesis 32:28. Abraham became Abraham in Genesis 17:5, when they entered a new relationship with God. But the great thing about this story is that it tells us how Jesus looks at men. He does not see what a man is, but also he sees what a man can become. Jesus looked at Peter and saw in him not only a Galilean fisherman, but the one who had it in him to become the rock on which his church would be built. Once someone came to Michelangelo, who was chipping away with his chisel a huge shapeless piece of rock. He asked Michelangelo what was he doing. Michelangelo replied, "I am releasing the angel imprisoned in the marble." Jesus is the one who sees and can release the hidden hero in every man. We continue to verse 43 to 51, where we are introduced to another character named Nathanael. Now, perhaps in Cana, Jesus found and called Philip. Philip, like Andrew, could not keep the good news to himself. He went and found his friend Nathanael, and he told him that he believed that he had discovered the long-promised Messiah in Jesus, a man from Nazareth. Nathanael could not believe that, because there was nothing in the Old Testament that God's chosen one should come from Nazareth. Nazareth was a quiet, undistinguished place. Nathanael himself came from Cana, another Galilean town, and In country places, jealousy between town and rivalry between village and village is notorious. So Nathanael's reaction was to declare that Nazareth was not the kind of the place that anything good was likely to come out of. Philip was wise. He did not argue. He simply said, "Come and see." So Nathanael came. Jesus could see into his heart. He says, "Here is a genuine Israelite, a man in whose heart there is no guile." Nathanael was surprised that anyone could give a verdict like that on so short an acquaintance, and he demanded how Jesus could possibly know him. Jesus told him that he had already seen him under the fig tree. What is the significance of a fig tree? To the Jews, the fig tree always stood for peace. Their idea of peace was when a man could be undisturbed under his own vine and his own fig tree. Please refer 1 Kings chapter 4 verse 25 and Micah chapter 4 verse 4. Also, the fig tree was leafy and shady, and it was the custom to sit and meditate under the roof of its branches. Nathanael could be doing this same thing under the fig tree. So, it was not so much that Jesus had seen him under the fig tree that surprised Nathanael. It was the fact that Jesus had read the thoughts of his inmost heart. He might have thought, "Here is a man who understands my dreams." Jesus quoted the old story of Jacob at Bethel, who had seen the golden ladder leading up to heaven. We see that story in Genesis chapter 28, verses 12 and 13. See, Nathanael is figuratively presented as sitting under the fig tree. He was searching the scripture for Messiah. He has only bookish knowledge. He now having a direct experience with Jesus, and he is reformed. He confesses, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." These are the statements written on the cross of Jesus. Jesus says, "You will see angels ascending and descending from heaven," which indicates communion of God with man. Nathanael is described as to Israelite. As we have seen, Israel is the name given to Jacob in Genesis 32. Now there is a problem that we face in this passage. Who was this Nathanael? In the fourth gospel, he is one of the first group of disciples. In the other three gospels, that is in the synoptics, he never appears. The explanations are different. Some argue that Nathanael is not a real figure at all. It is an ideal figure standing for all the true Israelites. Some others suggest that he stands either for Paul or for the beloved disciple. Paul was the great example of the Israelite who accepted Christ. Here also Nathanael is standing as an ideal. That is, he is a type, not a person. But we see this Nathanael appears again in John chapter 21 too. So it could not be a type. He should be a real person. A third suggestion is that Nathanael is Matthew because both Matthew and Nathanael means the names mean gift of God. So some suggest Nathanael is Matthew. We saw that in those days most people had two names, but then one name was Greek and the other Jewish. But in this case, both Matthew and Nathanael are Jewish names. So that suggestion also can't be considered. There is another simpler explanation. Nathanael was brought to Jesus by Philip. Nathanael's name is never mentioned in Synoptic Gospels. And in the fourth Gospel, Bartholomeo's name is never mentioned. Now, in the list of the disciples that we see in Matthew and Mark, Philip and Bartholomew came together as if it was natural and inevitable to connect them. So, Bartholomew is really a second name. It means son of Ptolemy. Bartholomew must have had another name, a first name. It could be possibly Nathanael. So, most of the scholars agree with the view that Nathanael is Bartholomew. Whatever else, it is true that Nathanael stands for the Israelite, whose heart was cleansed of pride and prejudice, and who saw in Jesus the one who satisfied the longing of his waiting, seeking heart. So with this, let us conclude this part of St. John's Gospel as we see the calling of the first disciples. We will continue to the second chapter of St. John, in which we see the beginning of the signs performed by Jesus. May God bless you. Stay blessed and safe until we meet again.